Hey there, so I'm in college, finally, and just finished my first week or so. And I've been doing a lot of thought on Judith Butler's Gender Trouble that I just finished a few weeks ago, and it's been giving me a lot of food for thought in terms of psychoanalysis. I have some Lacan on my reading list coming forward, and I was thinking about how to best explain this because I think it provides some interesting ways, at least the way Butler reads psychoanalysis and the Oedipus complex. It gives us a few ways into understanding maybe some of the problematics of the gender binary. So we're going to talk about the Oedipus complex first and kind of how psychoanalysis expands on that and maybe shows the limitations of psychoanalysis as such and also the gender binary. So the Oedipus complex is something that Sigmund Freud came up with, and Freud kind of has an interesting place in history. He has a lot of really interesting ideas, some of which I don't necessarily agree with, especially his interpretation of dreams. Sometimes kind of goes a little bit beyond what I'm willing to just take for his word. But nevertheless, Freud, some of his stuff is not really liked among psychologists or something like this. But at least in philosophy, he has a lot of importance because his work has been expanded upon greatly by Jacques Lacan, who founded psychoanalysis, which has gone on to influence, for example, thinkers like Zizek, who basically want to read Hegel through Lacan, which is pretty interesting and gives us some unique insights. And I think it provides us an interesting step, not necessarily to land on and stay there, but maybe to show some of the problematics that it brings about in the human condition, if we can even talk about such a thing. And the Oedipus complex is really a way of dealing with the love that is first felt between the mother and the child. When one hears about the Oedipus complex, kind of, the way I first heard about it, the son wants to have sex with his mom and kill his dad, which is kind of an extreme way of putting it and sounds quite crazy. But if we break it down into smaller terms, we can actually get at what Freud is trying to say here, and that is that when a mother gives birth to a child or goes through the process of creating a child in her womb, there's a sort of primordial kind of love, an untouched love that is experienced between the mother and the child. And this is tangible to anyone, especially mothers, who are aware of you grow very attached to your child, not only because they're yours, which is kind of empty on its own, but, because you can love children who aren't yours, but the fact that you have to gestate this child and make them, there's a very tangible difference in the kind of love that a mother feels for their child and the father does. And sometimes a mother might retort, to her husband, you just don't get it. Maybe this is kind of stereotypically when the mother is like a big worrier and is like, you don't understand the sort of attachment that I have to them. It's different with you, which is valid. And as such, all children reciprocate this love between themselves and the parent. In a sense, everyone's mom is their first love, and if we strip away all the incestuous or sexual connotations to this, it's fairly simple to accept. Of course, everyone, or not everyone, but most people love their parents, barring some sort of situation that causes distrust or that causes breakage within the family or something like this. Conservatives love to talk about, the breaking up of the family today, and talk about how that is destructive for society and stuff like that. And Freud and Lacan would probably agree with that, but that's beside the point. So there's a reciprocal love that each child feels to their mother, and one can empathize with this quickly if they imagine, being a child and kind of going through this experience of being held and cradled. This is kind of why it's almost stereotypical of like modern men don't want to be the little spoon because it's too vulnerable. It makes them feel like a child again. But this can actually be constitutive of some real deep love, and for anyone who's willing to take that step, you'll probably agree that this is kind of barring another kind of love that one can experience and kind of get back to, per se. But this love, obviously, it's very strong. Family ties are very strong in general, and you could say this is partially because the family is an institution of some kind. When you go to a family gathering and you see those family members you don't really know very well, other than your family tells you they are also your family, you don't really have any ties to them other than the sort of blanket institution of the family. So in a sense, there are some bonds that occur, and we can kind of phenomenologically just kind of spell this out by the fact that the family members that you have the closest relation to tend to be the ones that you love the most, whereas as you kind of get out into the recesses of your family tree, it's different. So, this love amongst family members has a limit, of course, and everyone knows this. There's a common incest taboo that persists throughout societies, that incest is bad, and there's kind of some interesting caveats to this. I think of like some of the biblical stories, or even in the Quran, where there's incest going on. I think of after Adam and Eve, we kind of have some interesting exceptions to that, but that's for another time. Kind of speaking from our perspective today, it seems that there's a pretty strong incest taboo. And this incest taboo goes into creating the Oedipus complex. So both the boy and the girl child are faced with the love of their mother. But this can't go beyond certain bounds. It must stay within the normal love that one feels and can't extend beyond that. And there's some biological programming that goes behind, setting these limits. And this is, of course, bound up with cultures and the way cultures kind of create institutions and things like this. But usually people don't have a problem with staying within these bounds. But of course, for Freud, at least in the absence of any taboos against something, sexual and romantic love are intertwined, if not completely the same thing. As such, the love that a child can feel for their mother must stop at the line between romance and sex. And as such, this is the deepest love that one can feel, is the love for their mother. Now, for the boy child, and this is usually the way that we are explaining the Oedipus complex, and I think this highlights a little bit of the sexist underpinnings of this theory, is that it essentially hinges around the masculine, and this is the problematic we'll come to later. But the boy child responds to this by internalizing this taboo, and the boy child must now renounce his love for his mother, because we can think of the male and the female side of this. The male, by falling in love with his mother, or going all the way and giving into his desires, is committing incest, but is nevertheless in a heterosexual relationship. So it violates one of the taboos, but not the second, that being homosexuality. Now, for the girl, this is a very different story, and this creates a two-tiered repression, which is a repression of incest and of homosexuality. So the male child is faced with the fact that they must bar this love from their mother in a sexual way. And the key part of psychoanalysis is that repression leads to violence and leads to conflict. And the psychoanalyst's job is essentially to uncover these desires that are being barred by repressions in order to relieve stress. So if there's some kind of stress going on, for example, in a relationship, in a man's relationship, the psychoanalyst will say, oh, it's the problem with your mother. It's kind of causing this rift between, the ideal state of love being your mother and then the relationship you're in. So the boy must shift away from this sexual love to the mother and instead shift this on to all other women. So, already it's not that the boy is only attracted to the mother, but rather that this is the ideal of love, the highest love that can happen. And as a result of the incest taboo, the boy is still allowed to love his mother in a sense, and be very close to the mother, but not to pass those sexual lines. And as a result, the boy is in a repressed state, so he harbors some covered up resentment for all other males because, and especially his father, because that's standing between him and the most ideal, perfect love possible. And we're just going to ignore the problematic undertones of this for now, just to get the theory across. So the boy is partially allowed to accept his desires of loving his mother. Now, the situation for the girl is very different. The girl must not only be repressed by the incest taboo, which prevents her from loving her mother sexually, but also must be repressed by the homosexuality taboo, which basically bars her from having any taste of that primordial love with the mother. She must now go on and love other men, and this causes her to want her father in a sense, because her father is standing in between her and her mother, but also simultaneously hate her father. And this is the real problematic part of the Oedipus complex, is that the girl must now go on to love guys and has to be completely separated from the woman, her mother, and thus all women, as a result of a taboo, as a result of a repression, and thus is sort of eternally betrothed to the father, the kind of the next door love, the most primordial love. You have this very strong relationship to your mother, but you also have a very strong love to your father. But simultaneously, the girl must hate her father too, because she too wants to get back to her mother, but of course cannot. So this sets up an interesting position in which the male is partially allowed to accept his desires, and the female is eternally forsaken from being truly in a loving relationship. And this is kind of the sexist underpinning of this, but Lacan goes on to do some interesting things with this, and he speaks of the phallus, which of course is the erect penis. And the way he sees it, the male has to be related to his sexuality in some way, and the the organs, the genitalia is kind of the physical manifestation of one's desire, and the way this interacts with the opposite sex or the same sex, because there's no reason to accept, other than the taboo, that there's a problem with same-sex attraction. And as a result, the male sexual organ becomes a method, in a sense, of wielding this sexuality. And this is why, having very large genitalia has historically been when tribes are fighting, this is kind of a way of expressing your masculinity. And in a sense, we can make sense of war as a consequent result of the taboo against the mother. There's a repression of love, and this results in war as a way to fight with other men, because of course all other men are a subset of their father, whom they want to depose in order to be the alpha and be next to their omega, their mother, and reunite in perfect love. So, in a sense, this makes sense of why, war is always kind of going towards peace, but in a way that almost makes sure that war continues to be propagated. And as such, the phallus becomes the method by which the males can fight amongst each other symbolically in order to try to get back to that love. Now, the woman of course is in a very different position, which is that she doesn't have a penis. And the way Freud would see it, she wants one, but she can't have it because she wants to be with her mother, and this requires the penis being the kind of the symbolic for this jouissance, this desire, this pleasurous desire between the child and the mother. And this, of course, is very sexually problematic, but there comes a great problem when we have this unevenness between the position of the male as a result of the Oedipal complex and the female as a result of the Oedipal complex, which is that the female is completely denied as a subject. No longer is she able to get back to love in any meaningful way, and thus a method of peace, but rather is eternally barred as a subject, subject of jouissance. And this creates some very big problems, which Judith Butler is very keen to point out by hearkening back to the Hegelian master-slave dialectic. In a sense, and it might be helpful to look at my master-slave dialectic video if you kind of want to get some insight into this more clearly, but I'll sketch it out kind of in analogy to this example. But the male stands in a position of mastery because they, in a sense, have mastered the road to pleasure, the road to jouissance, the phallus. And as a result, they are in a position of mastering of identity because the phallus is related to power and the way in which one has power by not being repressed. So we can read this psychoanalytically, which is that repression leads to not only a repression of identity, but power. That there's some kind of inherent power to people that is repressed by repression, of course. And as a result, because the male is partially able to reconnect with the love of the mother, but only partially, only insofar as the incest taboo restricts them, the male is in a position of authority and of power, and thus is bred phallogocentrism. And watch my Barbie video if you want kind of an interesting talk about that. But this kind of makes sense of when gender theorists or just kind of people today talk about the patriarchy. This kind of gains some philosophical underpinning through Freud and Lacan, and probably kind of Zizek too, even though Zizek is very anti-Butlerian. But the male subject is now in this position of real power, of power over love itself and peace as an extension of that. And the woman is barred from this completely, barred from having power as a real subject. And this creates a lot of problems when we think about this in the Hegelian master-slave dialectic. We can think of this kind of anthropologically, historically, in analogy to like an actual slave owner in kind of the US and like colonial US. You've got a slave owner who has a bunch of slaves who are subservient to him. And Hegel, in a sense, is both emancipatory in this way and also kind of detrimental. And that's kind of part of the dialectic, which makes it so fascinating. And of course, it's more philosophical than this. But Hegel says that in order to have an identity, we need to have an other. And that other itself needs to have a concrete identity. But we also need to usurp it and make it our own in order to make it affirm our own identity. So in the slave owner's example, the slave owner, his identity is confirmed by having slaves. We can think of this politically as this is kind of what people do at the time. And people will use this as an apologetic all the time, especially in like biblical conversations, as they'll say, this is slavery is just how it happened at the time. It's just, as if that excuses it. But the slave owner has some sort of political role because of his owning of slaves, and he also has a very real identity that is constituted by him owning slaves, because part of his identity is to be a master, to be something to which people are subservient. And in this case, the enslavement of people carries real power to it. This is almost kind of Hobbesian, of we just want to make everyone suffer for our gain and us not have to do anything, kind of prisoner's game dilemma kind of deal, and basically eternally forsake everyone so that we can be the one who reaps all the benefits. And for Hegel, this benefit is principally identity. Now, in the situation of psychoanalysis, we have a situation in which, because the phallus is the locus of power, the male is the ultimate master and the female the ultimate slave, but in a terrible way in which the female is a barred subject entirely. And the problem is, the man, of course, needs the woman in order to have an identity of his own. You can kind of think of that surface level, but also in a very philosophic way, insofar as, this is why solipsism is stupid, because in order for me to have an identity as, for example, being tall, I'm 6 foot, which, let's say that's tall. There are taller people and there are shorter people. The only reason I know I am tall is because I know there are others who are shorter than me. And kind of short as a universal. There are shorts and there are talls, and I'm one of the talls. And other than that, my height is just a part of me that doesn't really get noticed. It's trivial and it has no reference. This is kind of the yin and yang in a very surface level kind of way. And in addition to being a man, my understanding of what it is to be a man, yes, it has my own constitutive factors for what I take to be my own self-identity, but man is equally understood as being not woman, as being half of the binary, just like being tall versus being short, or being blind and being not blind, or being visually impaired and not visually impaired. This is kind of how color blindness doesn't really make sense unless we have a true blindness. And true blindness doesn't really make sense without true color blindness. Or I should re-say that. This is why color blindness doesn't really make sense without being able to see true color. And true color doesn't make sense without color blindness. Because the person who sees color can look at a colorblind person and say, you see color wrong, and thus I see it right. So there's a reciprocal thing that has to go on. And in terms of psychoanalysis, the man cannot completely be a man as such without the woman being there. But again, if she's a completely barred subject, we have a completely topsy-turvy dialectic going here, where, if we go back to the slave owner example, if he kills all of his slaves, well, he's lost all of the reason why he had them in the first place. Most principally probably labor, but there's all sorts of other factors that go along with this. And if he goes the other way around and allows them to become the master, well, then they overtake him because now they have the power to do so. So there's a careful balancing act that has to be happening. And the way Butler sees it, psychoanalysis does not allow for this balancing act to happen. The male is the only way to have power, and the phallus is the only way to have power. And as a result, the female becomes a subject insofar as she is her own impossibility, is kind of the way Butler roughly says it, which is that, she wants to attain to her mother through loving her father, but also through hating him in the same sense, and wanting to dispose of him in order to get back to that love. And this is the problem with the totalizing taboos of the incest taboo and the homosexual taboo, which creates a lot of problems and showcases not only problems with the taboos as such, but with the gender binary as such, because if we inevitably think of one side as owning the locus of power, the other is completely disposed of it, and thus eliminating the possibility for true subjecthood for women, and thus the true subjecthood of the man, because there's no longer any reference. The man is just tall, and there are no shorts. They are colorblind, and there are no people who see true color. So I think this kind of long and very philosophically dense yet broad discussion of psychoanalysis that Butler talks about is very interesting for seeing it has a lot of parallels to anthropology, of kind of how societies develop and how they might have developed some of these taboos, maybe for very valid biological reasons, but how this may have completely destroyed the possibility for true subjecthood or true identity as such. So I hope this has been good, and I'll see you in another one.